Alright, so we have solved quadratic equations by factoring, by taking square roots, by completing the square, and today we are going to conclude our lesson on solving quadratic equations by using the quadratic formula. Alright, now some bad news, some sad news. This is probably going to be the last video that you'll have to watch. Alright, this will probably be the last lesson before we start reviewing for the final exam. I know that'll make some of you sad. So, you still have all these videos though on Edpuzzle, so if you ever feel too sad, you can re-watch them. Now let's get started. Alright, so the quadratic formula, you can use the quadratic formula every single time if you wanted to. You could use it instead of completing the square or instead of factoring. But as you can tell by the actual quadratic formula, it's most of the time if you could factor or if you could solve it using square roots, or if you could complete the square, it's a lot easier than using this equation. All right, here's the this formula. Here's the quadratic formula. And we would use this quadratic formula for quadratic equations, solving quadratic equations, especially when you can't factor, or when you can't take the square root, or when you can't complete the square. You would use the quadratic formula. All right, and the quadratic formula is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. All right, write that down in notes. So here are your steps. First, make sure that the equation is set equal to 0, or written in standard form. And if it's not, make sure you set it equal to 0. Then you would need to identify your a value, your b value, and your c value, and substitute that into the quadratic formula. So this particular example equation is already solved for 0, and it's already in standard form. So you would just identify your a's, b's, and c's. So a is going to equal 1 in this case, b negative 5, and c is going to equal negative 36. And then once you've identified your a, b, and c value, you would substitute it into the quadratic formula. So it's going to be x equals negative b, well, b is negative 5, so it's going to be negative 5 plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is negative 5 squared, minus then 4 times your a value, which is 1, times your c value, which is negative 36. All right. And that's all divided by 2 times your a value, which is just 1. And from there you would simplify, and you'd be doing most of this on a calculator. So if we simplify this, x equals negative 5 will turn into a positive 5. And that's plus or minus. Then inside the square root bar, inside of the radical, we have a negative 5 squared, which is 25, positive 25. And then negative 4 times 1 times negative 36 would be a positive 144. And that's divided by 2 times 1, which is 2. Then that will turn into x equals 5 plus or minus, and you simplify what's in the radical, so 25 plus 144 is 169. Which will actually give us a nice square root there, because that's going to equal 5 plus or minus, and then the square root of 169 is 13 divided by 2. All right. And then from here you would split the cases up. You would do 5 plus 13 divided by 2 and 5 minus 13 divided by 2. And if you do that, you would get your two answers, which are negative 4. I'm going to run out of space here. Negative 4, comma 9. All right, those are your two answers. And that's how you would solve this particular quadratic equation using the quadratic formula. All right, now on your test on Friday, I am going to give you the quadratic formula. So you just need to make sure you're plugging everything in correctly, using your calculator correctly. But I will give you the quadratic formula. You won't have to memorize that for your test on Friday. Let's do a few more examples. So, solve each equation using the quadratic formula. So our first step is to make sure that it's set equal to 0 and it's in standard form. This is not set equal to 0, so we'd have to do that. We'd have to move that 12x over. And how would we do that? By subtracting 12x. And if you do that on both sides, you end up with 4x squared. And then 9 minus 12x would be negative 3x. and that equals 0. Then you would identify your A value, which is 4, your B value, which is -3, and your C value, which is 0. And you would plug that into your quadratic formula. So it would be x equals -3, because B is -3, plus or minus the square root of B squared, so that's -3 squared, minus 4 times A, which is 4, times C, which is 0. All divided by 2 times your A value, which is 4. All right. Well, over here, this -3 will turn into a +3. So I'll rewrite this over here. It's going to be x equals +3 plus or minus the square root of -3 squared is 9. And that's 9 minus, -4 times 4 times 0 would just be 0. So it would be 9 minus 0. So it's just the square root of 9. All right. And that's divided by 2 times 4, which is 8. All right. Now from here, you would go ahead and take the square root of 9. So it would be x equals 3 plus or minus 3 over 8. And then you would go ahead and split it up. So one of these is going to be x equals 3 plus 3 over 8. And one of these is going to be x equals 3 minus 3 over 8. So one of your answers is going to be 6/8, which simplifies to 2/4. Sorry, not 2/4, 3/4. And then your other answer is going to be 0. 3 minus 3 is 0, and 0 divided by 8 is 0. So that's how you would solve this using the quadratic formula. One more example. All right, this is already set equal to 0, and it's already in standard form, so we'll just identify our A, B, and C value. A is going to equal 1, B is going to equal +4, C is going to equal +1. All right, so we go ahead and plug this into our quadratic formula. It would be x equals -b, so it would be -4, because b is positive this time, so it would be just -4 plus or minus the square root of b squared, and I'll just go ahead and do b squared already. That's 16. 4 squared is 16. Minus 4 times a and c. Well, a and c are both 1, so it would be 4 times 1 times 1. So that's just going to be 4. And then that's divided by 2 times a, which it would be just 2 times 1, which would just be 2. All right, so here we're going to have x equals -4 plus or minus the square root of 12 divided by 2. All right, now we go ahead and simplify this radical a bit. We can change the square root of 12 to, and I'll do this on this side, we could change this to x equals -4 plus or minus, and then using the product rule, we could change this to the square root of 4 times 3 divided by 2, and again, using the product rule of square roots and radicals, we would be able to change that to x equals -4 plus or minus the square root of 4 times the square root of 3 over 2. And we could actually take the square root of 4. The square root of 4 is 2 times the square root of 3 over 2. And that would be your final answer. X equals -4 plus or minus 2 square root of 3 divided by 2. That's it. That's how you would use a quadratic formula. I know it's a complicated looking formula, but it's something that you'll have to hopefully memorize, especially once you get to Algebra 2. But for Friday's test, I'll give it to you. Just make sure you know how to plug everything in, and make sure you know how to work things out. Make sure you know how to put all this into a calculator. That's it. That was, I think that's going to be your last video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I will see you tomorrow. Have an awesome day.